Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I am living and speaking. And the traditional owners of this land are the Gadigal and Bijigal peoples. I invite you also to acknowledge country or to acknowledge land. Not all of you listening to this will be in unceded or stolen or occupied Indigenous territory, but colonization and imperialism affects all parts of this planet, wherever humans are. Acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge the sanctity, the inherent sanctity of this place, this country that I am living and breathing and working within. I acknowledge the devastating impact of invasion, imperialist occupation, and colonization in this continent, in this country I am in. And I acknowledge the strength, the survival, and the thriving of First Nations communities, elders, traditions, cultures, sciences, arts, kinship systems, governments. So this topic is always controversial. People have a lot of opinions, as do I, on this particular topic. And as you can see, this topic is traditional witchcraft, folkloric witchcraft. Sometimes these terms are used synonymously, and other times they are trying to point almost at different but connected phenomena and different but connected movements and different but connected attitudes to the practice of witchcraft or to the human relationship with the phenomena of witchcraft. So firstly, I identify as a traditional witch, and I also identify as a folkloric witch. And sometimes I'm just witch, and most of the time that is true. In terms of the way I am wielding and using these terms, I want to offer some amount of anchoring and elucidation, some amount of clarification. So many of you would know about the witchcraft revival that centers around a British civil servant by the name of Gerald Gardner, who is well known for founding, midwifing, propounding, or carrying on and potentially establishing a very particular form of witchcraft that has been called for decades now Gardnerian witchcraft. Another branch of that craft that is akin and within that Wiccan family is Alexandrian craft. And these traditions are often referred to in the modern witchcraft corpus as being either prominent, formative, and foundational. So it's important to know that in order to understand then the movement known as traditional witchcraft, capital T, capital W perhaps, that is in counter or tension or conversation with the Gardnerian Wiccan traditions or lineages. I am not an initiate of any form of Wiccan lineage, though I definitely am, definitely aspects of the craft that I practice are influenced by Wicca. It is hard to be a modern witch in the so-called West and not be either influenced knowingly or unknowingly or in tension with or conversation with Wicca. And so when I'm using that term, I'm using it as most of my Gardnerian and Alexandrian friends would be using that term, which is specifically to refer to those initiatory lineages that link to the New Forest Coven or perhaps to the Bricket Wood Coven, which is said to be the first coven founded by Gardner, which is propounding or teaching or transmitting this form of the craft, which has a Book of Shadows, 3 degrees, a moon goddess and a horned god of death and resurrection, works within a circle, has particular ways of raising power, has a high priestess who is first amongst equals, depending, and a high priest who may or may not be within the circle, incarnations of this horned god and witch's goddess. So those are some important parts, I guess, which you can find in published books. And if you are curious to learn more about that, where I have found the most lucidity and clarity is in a book called Wicca by Vivian Crowley. It has various subtitles and has various editions. So I think in order to be informed about the modern witchcraft revival, that is a great book to read, especially when looking for clarity around these Wiccan traditions and these Wiccan forms of witchcraft. So in conversation with, or tension or countering to that, is a movement that began with multiple groups of people who were largely unaffiliated, but became affiliated because of, one could say, the spreading of Gardner's form of witchcraft, which he always called witchcraft or witch cult, which is a Margaret Murrayism. And as this form of witchcraft became more and more publicized and more public through Gardner, through Alexander's, and also through the early high priestesses of this witch cult, like Eleanor Bone, Patricia Crowther, Doreen Valiente, who was in the Bricketwood Coven for a short term and then left and studied with other traditions, including those that she would have identified as traditional witchcraft, which she writes about in several of her books as such under that name. So this term is a known quantity in witchcraft circles. Early foreparents of the witchcraft movement in the so-called West, in Britain, in the United States, totally understand this term, and either they are using it to mean one of two things. Sometimes traditional witchcraft is being used to mean specifically these Wiccan lineages, and other times, in counter to and tension with that, it's referring to anything that may be drawing from an older source or a contemporary source, or a different source, but may have arrived at similar conclusions or may have arrived at vastly different conclusions, and thus the style, ethos, and inner attitude and philosophy of these craft houses or craft families or craft traditions could actually look very different. My own experience has been that in the various witchcraft traditions that I am connected to, either through intimacy, friendship, or through formal initiation, there is a lot of diversity. There is a lot of sameness, but there is a great deal of distinction. And the distinctions are just as important as the samenesses. So another interesting thing to remember is that almost all of Gardner's prominent public, I said gardeners, but yeah, I guess many of them were initiated by Gardner or people affiliated with Gardner, but many of the early Gardnerian high priestesses all write and talk about their connections with non-Gardnerian witchcraft. And the way I'm reading a lot of the way in which Lois Bourne, Doreen Valiente, Patricia Crowther, and Eleanor Bourne, particularly those four, talk about this is almost to extend legitimacy or to be very clear that there are other forms of witchcraft. In terms of Lois Bourne, she speaks a lot about Monica English in her book Dancing with Witches, a woman who was sent by another coven to kind of spy on this new sect of witches, and who was initiated into the Bricketwood Coven when Lois Bourne was working and active within it, and who over time befriended Lois Bourne, exposed herself as a spy or as someone checking in, on this new witch cult, and who eventually offered Lois Bourne initiation, according to Lois Bourne, into this different form of witchcraft that Lois Bourne discusses in her book. So that's number one, very important to remember. Eleanor Bourne claimed to be initiated into a hereditary form of Cumbrian witchcraft, which apparently she returned to towards, as she neared her death. Patricia Crowther, who is still alive at this recording, and I hope for much longer. She's, as far as I can tell, and from her books and her work, a marvelous and powerful witch and priestess. She often spoke about, and I think still does, Jean MacDonald, a Scottish witch, who sent her, like a witch's knife and a witch's bracelet and various things, and was basically suggesting that the form of witchcraft she'd been inducted to was a bit more primal and maybe not as sanitized as what she thought Gardner was speaking about, but that there were similarities, hence she reached out to Patricia Crowther. And then there's Doreen Valiente, who left Bricketwood Coven And she went and got initiation in several other forms of the craft. One, the clan of Tubal Cain, and Robert Cochrane is very pivotal and instrumental in this conversation and in the traditional witchcraft movement. Two, the coven of Atho, which is connected to Charles Cardell and his sister or friend, Mary Cardell, I believe her name was. And they were connected to a man by the name of Ray Howard, I believe. I'll correct myself below if my memory isn't serving me well, but usually it's pretty accurate. And this group of people had a form of craft together, but so did Ray Howard. Like, he had his own thing as well. You'll find sometimes in biographies of Doreen Valiente, it says Doreen Valiente was initiated into 4 branches of witchcraft. So I think we can see those 4 branches there, unless there's also a Sussex one that she doesn't speak so much about, because there are allusions to that, especially in her book and in analysis of that book by Ronald Hutton, which is, I believe, her first nonfiction book on witchcraft, which is Where Witchcraft Lives, which is about witchcraft and folk magic and folklore in Sussex. So the fact that, 4 of the most well-known, public, prominent witchcraft high priestesses connected to the Gardnerian tradition, espouse that there is other witchcraft, that there is sometimes, they call it hereditary or traditional witchcraft. This is a really important thing to remember, that those early formative high priestesses actually touted that line and expressed and communicated that they had direct and intimate experiences with those other forms of witchcraft. So this is important, because it's not just, there's this kind of strange delusion, I would say, in kind of contemporary right now witchcraft, and for the past 5 to 7 years, that traditional witches have come out of nowhere and are not connected to anything that might be lineaged, or it's just superfluous and it's just dark fluff. Now there are a bunch of people who could be said to be participating in dark fluff, but we need to remember that the traditional witchcraft movement is as old as the contemporary modern Wiccan revival, or the Wiccan movement, the Gardnerian Reformation, or whatever we want to call it. That there is a contemporary kind of explosion of witchcraft traditions, obviously spearheaded by Gardner, who I believe it was in 1951 was, the first so-called Western modern person to self-identify as a witch. Now, we also have newspaper articles from the early 50s. I believe the earliest that I can track is 1952, in which there is a quote from Rosalie Norton, who we would say is a traditional witch, although I don't think she ever used that term, who was working and living in Australia as an artist and a witch, and had a coven, and maybe a series of covens, where she self-identifies as a witch. And that those would be in the Australasian Post, which you can look up. There are archives. So, there's a whole family of jostling, arguing threads and lineages and orders and covens and individuals that are all arguing about who is more legitimate. Now, this is a really fucking common sociological event in almost any group of people that experiences social marginalization, that experiences identity crisis, or internal identity communication, that experiences any kind of that is practicing some secretive or clandestine or covert or discreet thing. And this could be ethnic groups, this could be activist groups, this could be feminist groups, this could be communist groups. Like, who is the more legitimate, the more authentic, the more correct? This happens everywhere. Let us not kid ourselves that this is a witchcraft only phenomenon. It is not. So it is not unusual that these competitions of authenticity happen. Certainly, you know, witchcraft is witchcraft at the end of the day. But it's important, I think, to look at and search into and explore what some of these terms mean and what some of the people who are using these terms might be meaning by them. Traditional witchcraft can manifest in a variety of ways. Sometimes it is a really helpful term, and other times even I find it to be a really kind of like, why am I even saying this? But sometimes it's the easiest way to locate something. And for people who might be sharing and resonating with certain styles or ethos or philosophy or even ritual cosmology, to find each other and have more intimate conversations. Certainly, I have had conversations with witches of a variety of traditions and non-traditions, of a variety of lineages and houses and covens. And I have found fellowship with them all. You know, with, like, I find fellowship with Gardnerian witches, with fairy witches, of which I happen to be one, with reclaiming witches, with wildwood witches, and I'm, you know, involved in those traditions, with people involved in sabbatic craft or 1734, or, you know, I have friends within Dianic craft. So there is a lot going on, you know, there is a lot going on in this witchcraft renaissance that has been kind of pumping itself since the late 40s, early 50s. You know, what I mean when I say traditional witchcraft is I am talking, I guess, generally, but also specifically about witchcraft practices and traditions that emerge out of, are anchored to, and are directly inspired by pre-modern European witch lore and folk magic. And so this is, there's a lot of also fairy faith involved in that. If you are someone who is nerding out on this, you will absolutely know that various European cultures' relationship to the good neighbors and the lore around that is twinned with and totally connected to lore and folk understandings of witches. So that's important to remember, that generally speaking, if you are coming across a traditional group of witches that centers ecstatic flight, that centers intimate spirit connection, often erotic or often very, very, you know, interpersonally active, that centers familiar spirits, that centers initiation or sponsorship by those spirits, that centers oracular and transpossession experiences with witch gods or wild spirits or land wights or ancestral mighty dead, that centers folklore and magical connection with the good neighbors, that centers necromancy and other forms of folk divination, folk methodology around magic. Often witchcraft traditions that could be said to be traditional or folkloric will be dual faith, or will be maybe not dual faith, but will be not necessarily entirely pagan with a capital P. Like you know, I myself, I used to identify as pagan with a capital P, but years ago now I divested myself of that, and I still have never taken it back on because it's not true for me. Like, I am as influenced by mystical Christianity as I am, and by Gnosticism, which some forms of Gnosticism are pre-Christian or are not Christian, as by, you know, Hinduisms, as by, you know, paganisms. Like, all of them equally inspire and influence the way I am with my craft. But first and foremost, I am a witch, and you will find that kind of attitude or understanding with folkloric witches or traditional witches. And sometimes people who you could say are folkloric or traditional witches in that modern parlance would just not use that terminology at all. And it's also important to remember not to, especially with, traditions of magic and spirit work that might seem inherently witchy as fuck, that are outside of that influence. It's important to remember not to colonize and force Englishisms and Anglophonic and Anglo-cultural structures and paradigms on other, spirito-magical, ecstatic, oracular, transgressive traditions that might be African, or that might be from Southeast Asia, or from the continent known as South America. It is also important to know that this is highly nuanced, and because of imperialism and colonization, people who are ethnically Mexican or ethnically Lakota or ethnically Brazilian, or or ethnically Balinese, like myself, that actually it is also very common for people who speak English, who are part of those communities, cultures, and ethnicities, to use that word sometimes. An example of that is, while you will never find me saying that my father's mother, my Balinese grandmother, my dadong, was a witch. I'll never say that. Other members of my Balinese family will, those who speak English specifically and who are more westernized. So that's interesting. And while I don't do that, they do. So there's also this, English influences a lot of cultures, and Anglophonic structural ideas and historical phenomena influence when there is resonance, or when the key fits the keyhole, so to speak. So these things are nuanced. They aren't black and white. We can't just say, oh, because they're not from a white culture, they aren't a witch. This is actually highly confusing and disorienting and complex. So there are, the Spanish word bruja, and I believe in Brazilian Portuguese, it's pronounced something like bruxa, which is, Portuguese, that those words, which mean witch, are often used today, and have been for decades, by members of those communities, both against, particular service magicians, or people you'd think of as healers or cunning people, or people you might think of as like malevolent magic workers, but also by the people who are bruja, brujo, bruxa, bruxo, So that's important to remember. And that too is distinctly folkloric and traditional witchcraft. So this is a very broad and complex and convoluted labyrinthine thing. So I hope I'm expressing that when someone says, well, hopefully, when someone says traditional craft or folkloric witchcraft, it is never a monolith. It is never just one thing, where there is, like, one popular example is, there is a witch father and a witch mother, and we have witch festivals too. We just might call them different names. And we also have this compass, but it's like a circle, and that's valid, but it's much more complex than that, actually. And also, it's, I've also watched and read a lot of criticism of traditional witchcraft by modern Wiccans, who might be saying, well, you say this, or you have this, and you too have circles, and let us not assume that the way in which one witch might be working with a circle or a compass or a crossroads is anything like the cosmology that you're drawing from. There are traditions of witchcraft that do not concern themselves with Empedoclean elements at all. There are traditions of witchcraft that do not, they might use the words blessed be and so mote it be, but do not really observe the wheel of the year. In Anderson Ferry, which I would call, and many initiates would say, is an American traditional witchcraft, or an American folkloric witchcraft, or just an American witchcraft, even though it exists in various countries and continents at this point, would, many initiates in that tradition and those lineages pretty much only honor Bjaltana and Samhain, because Victor and Cora used to say, oh, look, as long as you mark those two great hinges of the year, that's all we care about. Like, that was, other early fairy initiates might have been trying also to create rituals for the, the 8 sabbats of the year that are carried through and propounded in Gardnerian and Alexandrian craft, and that definitely has influenced many witchcraft traditions and also neo-paganism at large, and Druidry, although that could have just been an early conversation between Ross Nichols and Gerald Gardner. No one really knows. Some people know more than others in this regard. But this Wheel of the Year, whether or not you're celebrating that, how it's good to never assume what that means to a group of people. There are traditions of witchcraft that simply mark and honor the 4 great festivals. Some might call them the Celtic fire feasts or the cross quarters. There are other traditions of witchcraft I know, like fairy, that will have 2 that are important, but some initiates might mark the others, depending on your lineage or branch. There are others within Wildwood, for instance. The 8 feasts are very central, but not to every initiate. Like I would say, largely all of us, but you do not have to mark the 8 festivals of the year as a Wildwood witch. It's not required. It doesn't have to be central to your Wildwood witchcraft. And even though most of us will have a deep, mythic, initiatory journey with that, it's not required, and it's not necessarily even central. So whereas in other traditions, it might be like the pinnacle, the central hinge or whatever. So it's always good never to assume what is meant, even if similar language is being used. And as well as this, another phenomenon that has happened and is important to remember is that in the 60s and 70s in places like Turtle Island or North America, countries like the United States, there definitely were and are people who have family traditions of magic and spirit work. It is actually not as rare as people make it out to be. That's just frankly true. I come from one. Many people come from hereditary lineages and hereditary cultures and families of magic and spirit work and divination, whether they're influenced also by spiritualism, whatever cultures, whatever religious doctrines. It is actually more common than you would suspect. And some of them are formalized and some of them are less formal. But so within that, there are people who might wake up to their witch blood or realize they are a witch, and that their parents or their uncles or their aunties or their grandparents were teaching them something that was very often hush, don't let anyone know, don't let the parish priest know, because there's, an understanding that this is transgressive within the society or potentially problematic to certain people, that others might call you a witch. And even though we don't use that word, they would see it this way. And so that self-reflection builds, and maybe someone's inner mythic life takes them in a particular way. They take that hereditary material, they meet other self-identified witches who are largely probably working in a Wiccan framework, and they think, oh, okay, so this is witchcraft. And so they cross-pollinate, they receive, they take on other forms and outer forms which might help to fill in or create a structure and a framework for that lineage to thrive. That happens. One clear example of that is the tradition that stems down from Lady Circe in the United States, which is often talked about by Orion Foxwood. So these things are present, they're complex. And when someone is saying that they're a traditional witch, or that traditional witchcraft is a thing, it's important to remember not to assume anything particular about that. In the same way, it's important to not assume that we know what is meant by Wiccan or Wicca. So ideally, we explore, we correct ourselves when we get new information, we ask people who are involved in those traditions so that we can have access to responses that are contextualized and that are earnest and sincere. There are so many people out there who will want to tell you that their tradition is the correct and one true way. There are people out there who might even want to delude you and have deluded themselves into this notion that they have access to an apostolic lineage that goes back to the Paleolithic from one person to the next. And that idea, which is so influenced by certain forms of the Christian church and certain fraternal secret society notions, is actually not necessarily very native to what I know of as the spirit of the witch, or as witchcraft, which manifests in a variety of ways and will never die. Witchcraft can be that awakening that happens to someone, whether young or middle-aged or older, often by a familiar spirit, often by a series of spirits and a series of events that wakes one up to one's reality, to one's self, to one's charge. And then over time, whether those spirits are able to, fully teach and pass on what they need to that witch, or whether they direct that witch to human teachers and human groups. That's folkloric witchcraft. Like, if you're looking at the trials, it's not necessarily, you could interpret it this way, but it's not always saying things like, and this person went to this high priestess, and this person went to this coven. Yes, there are covens in the witch trials, but just as often, there are just people who meet spirits at a hedgerow or, in a forest, and are taught directly by them how to heal, how to hinder, how to harm, how to shapeshift, how to fly. Certain objects will be given to them, certain books, certain plants. Go here at this time. I'm coming through the window to take you to this gathering. We're going to go into the Hollow Hills and feast with the elves. Like, this is folkloric witchcraft. And in many, many cultures around the world to this day, it is a known quantity that people will be contacted by ancestral spirits or spirits of the land or godlike beings and brought to their shamanistic charge or brought to their magical charge. And, sometimes, not all the time, there are human mentors and teachers. And this, I'm talking about traditional societies that I have contact with and that I know about. Like, this is a thing that happens. So of course it happens in countries like Australia, like Aotearoa, like Britain, like Cornwall, like France. Of course it happens. It is a human universal phenomenon. So if, it's witchcraft, I think, if there are spirits. It's witchcraft if there is some amount of non-sanctioned transgressive behavior. Witchcraft isn't easy or comfortable, and it doesn't make people feel easy or comfortable. Yes, it can be supportive and nourishing and empowering and profound, but it is essentially initiatory. And I don't mean in any apostolic succession way. I mean, it is going to, be it is going to awaken us to who we really are and who we can really be. It is going to unleash power. It is going to bring us to our shadow, to the guardian at the gates, to borrow that Jungian term. It's going to break us down and make us face what is insubstantial, what is illusion, what isn't really working, what is our deepest, darkest truth, and bring us through those gates if we survive it. And we learn certain methods and techniques and magical processes along the way because they help us actually do all of that. And then maybe we can be practically, proficiently useful and helpful to our witch communities and to our non-witch communities. Some of us will be those people who take on cunning folk or service magician roles. Others of us will be much more internal, and others of us might not even be aware it's happening. There are so many people out there who are witches, who are not aware of what's going on, and who, their families might have repressed it for generations, and they might be Christian, or they might be an atheist, or they might be agnostic, and shit's going on, they're seeing things are happening, they're accidentally making things happen, and they may never realize that there is something out there for them that could help refine, deepen, and grow them. That happens too. So this is all to say that, when I'm using these terms, it's really complex. And as, it's important to express and communicate that there are no ultimate answers here that are going to suit your all your needs, that are going to answer all your questions. Witchcraft itself is a question. Witchcraft itself is a happening. Witchcraft itself is a mystery. And if you are drawn to it because you are, then it's going to be interesting. You will not be bored. And sometimes you will be, and that's that paradox too. This is hard work, and there is discipline and rigor and letting go and surrender required. So I hope you got something out of that. Blessings.